A Citrus Legacy was made possible by a grant from the Dr. P. Phillips Foundation.
I heard what sounded like rifle shots in all directions. It was bark freezing and splitting. I suddenly realized that we were about to feel some very large changes in our lives.
During the last 2 centuries, the names Phillips, Roper, Caruso, Griffin, Keene, Sanford, and Battaglia, they conjured up images of the Sunshine State. They were some of the central players in a hard-fought revolution of innovation that made Central Florida the largest citrus producer in the world, bringing fortunes to some, devastation to others. Central Florida's legacy is rooted deep in the citrus industry. For hundreds, even thousands of years, the fruit of the citrus tree has symbolized eternal love, happiness, and even holiness. But nowhere on earth has the golden fruit held more importance than in Florida, where citrus growing and processing has blossomed into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Although citrus has been a part of the Florida landscape since the Spanish introduced it in the mid-1500s, mass commercial exploitation of the fruit didn't start until the latter part of the 19th century. During the mid-1800s, the Civil War brought death and destruction, and the horrors of war took its toll, pitting brother against brother and destroying family homes and farms. And at the end of the Civil War, thousands of displaced Americans searched for a new beginning. Many traveled west to homestead in Kansas and Nebraska. But others, introduced to Florida's mild winters during the war, headed south. And Florida, perceived as a backward, underdeveloped, and underpopulated area, became the land of gold and opportunity. It rapidly became a land for creating and fulfilling desires. And during the 1870s and 80s, thousands of new settlers poured into Florida. The Evans family was one of them.
You think about the sacrifices your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents made coming to Florida and settling Florida in the late 1800s was tough. It was a tough place to settle. There were mosquitoes, there was a lot of water, it was hot, it was humid, the food was bad. I mean, it was a tough place to be. So it was a real commitment to come to Florida and start over again after the war between the states.
In 1876, the Jacksonville Press wrote, "With the orange successfully cultivated in every county and all the carpetbaggers with their abundant ills, Florida will certainly be the garden of the continent." Florida quickly became known as the poor farmer's paradise. And on acreage considered laughable in the West, farmers in Florida successfully worked small farms and groves. And by 1880, Florida boasted 23,000 farms. And just as cotton was king of the Old South, citrus quickly became the symbol of Florida. Now orange fever swept through Florida. Pamphlets and books promoted it as a place where persons with limited capital could come and reap huge profits in the citrus industry. And came they did, by foot and in wagons, seeking their piece of America. Among Florida's original citrus pioneers to answer the call were William C. Roper, Dr. Philip Phillips, General Sanford, as well as Sidney and Joshua Chase, each planting the seeds of Florida's citrus legacy. Along with the Dunaways and the Spears, William Roper was one of the first of these citrus pioneers to arrive. He settled in on the slopes of Winter Garden's Lake Apopka in 1857. He brought with him several slaves and barrels packed full of Confederate money, which proved worthless at the end of the war. His savings gone, Roper planted one of the first groves in West Orange County and learned that by properly tending Florida's sand and muck soil, it could often yield 2 crops a year. Even groves as small as 5 acres could produce a handsome profit. Those modest beginnings set in motion what eventually would grow into one of the most successful family citrus businesses in Florida. Citrus groves quickly began to cover the central Florida's landscape. Oranges were by far the crop of choice. In 1885, Florida produced over 600,000 boxes of them. By the mid-1880s, well over $10 million had been invested in the citrus industry, and there seemed to be no end in sight as it continued to draw more investors and cover more acres. Then on January 9th, 1886, Mother Nature dealt a devastating blow. Without warning, temperatures dropped below freezing for 4 consecutive days. And on January 11th, 1886, the temperatures in Orange County dropped to 19 degrees. The following day, they fell even more. Growers, most experiencing a prolonged freeze for the first time, looked on helplessly as their groves froze and died. One grower's journal reads,
Most all oranges and leaves are on the ground, and the trees are quite bare. The frozen oranges are all rotten. This is Florida's funeral. Guess everything's ruined.
For many growers, it was an abrupt end to a dream. Some were forced to leave their houses and land in search of other opportunities. But the citrus industry fluctuated wildly during the early days. And by 1889, healthy citrus trees covered over 16,000 acres in Orange County alone. Well, that spread to over 22,000 by 1894. A record 4 million boxes of oranges marked the 1893 and 94 harvests. Citrus pioneers came in all shapes, sizes, and financial worth. In 1878, a penniless young man of 18 named Sidney Chase arrived in Sanford, Florida. And he accepted a job grubbing stumps in General Sanford's Bel Air Grove. He worked for little pay, room and board, but Sidney learned the citrus business from the roots up and quickly realized this was his future. It was in 1884 that he convinced his older brother Joshua to leave the sales position he secured in a New York manufacturing and import company to join him in Florida. Their long-term intent was to own their own groves and shipping business, and on May 15th of that year, Chase and Company was formed. At first, they were insurance brokers and then grew into fertilizer sales, and in 1 year, they had placed their savings into citrus. With opportunities still outweighing risk, more citrus pioneers arrived. Among them, Dr. Phillips, a name that today's Orange County residents know well.
My father came to Florida as a young man. He had not started a medical practice, but he came here to investigate the possibilities of settling here. He got as far as Satsuma and took about $5,000 that my grandfather had given him and bought a grove in the fall of 1894. Howard Phillips.
His timing would prove disastrous, though, because on December 29, 1894, the first of 2 severe freezes descended down the East Coast and into Florida. It sent the temperatures into the teens and devastated Florida's young citrus industry. And Dr. Phillips had to watch in horror as his groves froze and his harvest destroyed.
Ice and snow in Florida. Oranges on the tree frozen. It is the story of ruin.
and wrote the daily Florida Citizen newspaper. For some, the loss was overbearing, and in his book, Open for the Season, Carl P. Abbott writes,
About 9 that night, a fine-looking gray-haired man in a black frock coat and Stetson hat walked up the street in front of the hotel, looked at the thermometer, groaned, "Oh my God," and immediately shot himself through the head.
Many growers still had hope. The shocked, defoliated trees responding to the warm, rainy weather in January began to show signs of life again. And the sap began to flow, and the trees started to push out new growth. But just as it appeared there was a chance for recovery, a second severe freeze hit the following year. On February 7th, 1895, the headline in the Florida Times-Union read, "Florida again frozen." One grower wrote in his diary,
It was an awful day, the worst Florida had ever seen. I heard what sounded like rifle shots in all directions. It was bark freezing and splitting. I suddenly realized that we were about to feel some very large changes in our lives.
Another wrote,
This country has been one terrible disappointment. People have left and are still leaving the state. Great numbers of them. Very many leaving their homes that have been made by much hard work and considerable expenditures of money to go just to ruin. 'Tis most discouraging. C.W. Overstreet.
Of course, the big freeze was December of '94, and then it came back in January, February of '95 and wiped out the industry virtually. So many people went back north and gave up on citrus.
with his groves in ruin, a discouraged Dr. Phillips packed his belongings and traveled back to Tennessee to start his medical practice. Many saw the double-barrel freeze of 1894 and 1895 as the end of Florida's citrus industry. Well, the groves were laid to ruin, dreams turned into nightmares, and personal fortunes eliminated. Many of the northern victims of citrus fever found the life of a citrus baron a lot harder than they imagined. With their groves all but annihilated, Joshua Chase left for California. But pioneers like Dr. Phillips and William Roper and Sidney Chase, although disappointed, they didn't lose sight of their dreams. Many immediately began the rebuilding process and were joined by newcomers eager to establish their own groves. Sidney Chase, he stayed in Florida and tried to revive his groves. Disillusioned by the freeze, John Sanford, a cousin to Sidney's first employer, General Sanford, took over the Bel Air Grove. But another freeze in 1899, Sanford was no longer interested in Florida's citrus and searched for a buyer. The freezes had been devastating to the industry, and few wanted to invest in reviving groves. By 1900, land prices for groves had fallen in value from $200 per acre to $1 or $2 per acre. On April 1st, 1902, Sanford wired Chase asking him to make an offer on Bel Air, saying it seemed most fitting that Sidney should own Bel Air since he began his career there as an orange grower. Thinking it was an April Fool's joke, Sidney submitted a small offer, which to his surprise was accepted. Chase and Company was back in business. The Chase brothers would become instrumental in the development of Islesworth. This was a prime citrus producing area just south of Windermere in Orange County. While Florida was preparing to enter its golden era of citrus, the rest of the nation was also advancing. The turn of the century was a time for celebration. The Wright brothers would soon conduct their first flight. The Ford Motor Company was ushering in the age of the automobile. In large cities, electric lights replaced the candles, and people were flocking to see the new art of motion pictures. The telephone revolutionized personal communications, and John Philip Sousa exploded on the scene. A new sense of optimism gripped the country. Although wiped out during the freeze of 1895, Dr. Phillips never lost his orange fever. He first traveled as far as Cuba, thinking it would be natural for citrus, but found the island on the verge of what was later referred as a splendid little war. So he returned to Florida and acquired a grove on Big Sand Lake after being told that it was a frost-proof location. And though in later years freezes would extend past Lake Wells, the northern winds crossing the lake raised the temperatures in the grove just enough to ward off a freeze. That was something that Dr. Phillips took a note of and put to good use. By 1907, he bought another grove in Altamont Springs and established his first packing house in what is now downtown Orlando. Citrus growers had more than freezing temperatures to worry about, though. A prolonged drought that lasted from 1906 to 1907 caused widespread damage, as did pest infestations and hurricanes.
At that time, the growing of citrus was fairly hazardous business. And in 1907, when the national panic hit, my father found himself with a substantial number of groves, not all of which were paid for. There was a 9-month drought and a freeze. Howard Phillips.
Florida citrus growers faced several devastating droughts during the first part of the century. During the late 1930s, Orange County growers were threatened by yet another long, dry spell. But Dr. Phillips, he decided to think out of the box. So in April 1939, Dr. Phillips brought Lily Stoats, a 67-year-old rainmaker, to Orlando in hopes of ending the dry spell. On April 7th, Lily sat on the shores of Sand Lake, projecting herself to bring rain. Well, she asked only her expenses be paid for her appearance. And whether she was responsible or not, rain fell on April 8th. Her appearance caused so much controversy in Orlando that Dr. Phillips offered $10,000 to anyone who could prove that she did not produce the generous showers. Another of the problems facing growers was transporting the oranges to northern markets. Until the transportation revolution of the 1880s and 90s, Florida remained isolated from the rest of the country. Growers depended primarily on rivers as a basic means of transportation. This forced many growers to locate their groves near waterways, of course. The first fruit shipped to northern markets was literally dumped, uncured, ungraded, and unsized, into empty flour barrels padded with Spanish moss. Steamboats were used for carrying the barrels, and later boxes of perishable fruit from various loading docks in Sanford and Lake Dora, up the St. Johns River to Jacksonville, and then on to Savannah, where locomotives rushed the winter fruit north to Chicago and New York. Florida began modernizing during the 1880s and 90s. The sounds of hammered spikes and the shriek of steam whistles reverberated across Florida's interior. In less than 2 decades, Florida quadrupled its railroad mileage, laying over 2,500 miles of new track by 1895. The railroads took on an even greater importance as they plotted where towns would be built. They helped finance the buildings of packing houses and planned agricultural communities around their routes. They also provided an early warning system against freezes. Until railroads were established, freezing warnings were limited to telegraph lines. The word rarely reached the growers in time to prepare for the oncoming freeze, so the railroads used their whistles to sound the alarms of a coming freeze. Heard for miles, the whistles would signal growers of the advancing cold front. Growers, becoming increasingly aware of the need to better market their products, began uniting into cooperatives. Between 1900 and 1909, numerous growers' organizations were created. The Florida Citrus Exchange, the Winter Garden, South Lake Apopka, and the Orlando Citrus Growers Association all came into being.
They'd all have meetings and try to decide how many containers they were going to have, what the size and shape. John says, you boys can sit here and decide anything you want. If my customers want them in silk stockings, I'll ship them in silk stockings. So agreements among those old-timers lasted just as long as it took for them to get out of the meeting and get to a telephone and quote something different.
Between 1910 and 1919, newcomers were arriving in droves. Many were northern investors, gentlemen farmers.
Well, a gentleman-type farmer for citrus is one who owns the property but does not really supervise its operations like spraying, pruning, and cultivation of the citrus. And he turns it over to somebody else to take care of his grove and sell the fruit and manage it for him. That's a gentleman-type farmer.
1920 marked the beginning of Florida's land boom. Real estate speculation drew hundreds of new residents, many with a fast buck philosophy. Groves were bought and sold as if there were no tomorrow, and new developments sprang up in various locations to provide northerners an opportunity to invest in the citrus industry. It was the roaring 20s, a flapper. People had money to burn and were becoming interested in health-related products, something citrus marketers used to their advantage. Citrus resorts were set up to wine and dine northerners until they invested in the groves of their own. Copy for the Holly Hill Inn proclaimed that it was
not a jazz palace or dress-up spot, but a refined resort appealing to the better element and just the spot for the regular Sunday foursome.
More and more people took the bait and invested in the small groves, which would then be managed by companies associated with the sellers. Oh, it seemed like the good times would never end. Then there were those like Grace Mather Smith, rich northerners who bought groves and moved to Florida because it was fashionable. The young Mrs. Smith and her aging husband built a 22-room mansion overlooking Lake Apopka on her 40-acre Edge Grove estate. Now, she was a beautiful and generous woman, and she often posed for photographs used on citrus labels, and also sponsored local theater skits, vaudeville acts, and the chorus at the Orlando Opera House. But it was her lavish lifestyle and parties that kept her an outsider and the talk of the town. Grace Mather Smith was a different kind of citrus pioneer. She helped introduce art and culture to Central Florida while scandalizing the conservative community. But by the close of the 1920s, the good times and uncontrolled speculation enjoyed by the citrus growers abruptly collapsed. While the stock market crash of 1929 laid ruin to the industrialized North, the Mediterranean fruit fly devastated Florida's orange dreams. The infestation affected over 75% of the state's citrus trees. So encompassing was the damage that the federal government placed an embargo on all citrus from affected areas, enforced by armed troops. The general manager of the Dr. Phillips Company wrote,
"We were notified by the federal government that this grove and all other groves in the territory went under quarantine on midnight, May 31st. It is unfortunate that conditions have become so demoralized. As the season advances, a real honest-to-God panic developed with the growers. Our own losses this season were the most horrific in the history of the business."
Thus began 2 decades of hardships and uncertainty for citrus growers. The Mediterranean fruit fly eradication campaign had serious and lasting effects on the local industry. Orange County growers lost more heavily in the eradication than any other part of the state. Groves were destroyed and fortunes lost. Bert Roper, grandson of citrus pioneer William Roper, remembers the devastation.
And they actually stripped trees, and I barely remember as a child out on the, just north of the home grove, probably great big piles of oranges, they'd pile them up and burn them.
The Depression made growers extremely cost-conscious and, out of necessity, responsive to new ideas. Well, it was time for innovation. Dr. Phillips' canning plant increased its research to perfect the process of citrus. After experiencing many failed attempts, a major breakthrough was achieved: flash pasteurization. which greatly improved juice quality and brought quick consumer acceptance of the canned product. And Dr. Phillips became the largest producer of citrus in the world, and his state-of-the-art packing house was a major turning point in citrus production. So cutting edge was his streamlined process that tours were set up to introduce the operation to the public. In 1930, Dr. Phillips received the endorsement of the American Medical Association, further helping promote his citrus products. Several years later, Dr. Phillips again was at the forefront of the innovation. On May 10, 1934, Dr. Phillips was the first to use an airplane to dust citrus groves.
So the concept was to use an airplane, but use a different type of material, which was sulfur, and fly over the groves very low altitude and dust them real quickly. And that proved a logical way to go if you had large plantings, and Dr. Phillips had large plantings.
The Orlando newspaper reported the historic event.
2,000 citrus trees dusted for the rust mite and red spider in half an hour. An airplane reinforced with deadly sulfur dust skimmed the treetops at a speed of 100 miles per hour. It was a first in the history of the citrus industry. The machine almost grazed the tops of the trees as the thick, cough-provoking mixture came pouring down from the air.
People came from all over Florida to witness history being made. Although the method proved effective, it was extremely hazardous because static electricity can ignite the sulfur. In 1937, the first plane disaster occurred. A pilot, he was wanting to finish his dusting early so he could return to his home in Texas, was flying at treetop level in Dr. Phillips' Turkey Lake Grove when the sulfur dust ignited. The plane burst into flames and crashed, killing the pilot. Growers have always been proud of their product. Beginning in the mid-1880s, long before slick advertising campaigns, tourism boards and Chamber of Commerce beckoned people to Florida. Citrus growers promoted the Sunshine State along with every crate of fruit they shipped north. Citrus labels, vivid colors, squares, and stripes on the side of the wooden shipping boxes were Florida's first billboards. Over 5,000 different labels were produced between the late 1900s and World War II, each identifying a particular brand of citrus. The brand name labeling helped growers build their own individualized images while bragging about their state at the same time. The images conveyed on the labels distinguished one grove from another, one variety from another, and different grades as well as targeted specific markets. Labels such as Dr. Phillips Favilla brand pictured the Phillips Orlando home. The Billy Bob brand from the Battaglia Fruit Company used a Christmas picture of his sons. The Caruso family used the Bluebird and Cardinal labels.
Well, I think my father bought those labels from somebody out in the state of Washington, and he was very proud of those labels and put good quality under it, and just hoped that people would recognize it when they saw it. Of course, when they got in the grocery store, most of them lost all identity, but as far as wholesalers and the purchasers of the product, it made a lot of difference.
Images of women, a favorite theme, continually increased in sexuality to appeal to buyers. The label shifted from Southern belles to short-skirted flappers to pin-up girls. And one of the most popular was Fred Johnson's Nudist brand label. Blacks were a favorite subject and were usually treated with what people then considered folksy charm. During World War I and World War II, patriotism was displayed in the Yankee Boy, Bugle, Leatherneck, and All Clear labels. Growers constantly updated their labels. For them, their labels symbolized pride and progress and helped them establish a reputation in a crowded market. During this period, the name Caruso and Battaglia joined the Phillips and Ropers as key players in the citrus industry. At 11 years old, Philip Caruso, an Italian-born immigrant, arrived in New York's Ellis Island with a dream of beginning a new and better life. It was 1902, and to support his mother and 3 sisters, he sold fruit from a push cart on the streets of New York. This young boy managed to parlay the meager money he earned and the knowledge he gained about American businesses into one of the biggest produce businesses in New York State, and finally into one of the biggest citrus-producing businesses in Florida.
It took an individual with a lot of guts, I think, to get into the citrus business. Some of them were already in the business in one way or the other as caretakers and just grew into it. And some of them came down from the north, like my father did.
With his health dictating a move to a warmer climate and the large retail food chains beginning to appear in the early 1920s, Caruso lamented,
"The wholesale produce dealer is on the way out. The chains and cooperatives will build their own produce warehouses, buy their own carloads of produce, and ship it to their stores in their own trucks. But one thing they won't do is grow their own product."
In 1925, Philip Caruso sold his successful New York produce business and moved to Winter Garden, Florida, where in 1926 he established Southern Fruit Distributors.
It was basically a family operation of 3 families, actually, that had been in the produce business and had been buying it from Florida and reselling it, wholesaling it in New York. So they were merely cutting out the middleman when they came down here and started buying the fruit and groves, and then it transcended into fresh fruit packing and ultimately the concentrate.
He purchased the rights to the Bluebird name and built his business on integrity and one-family ownership. His sons Austin, Joseph, and Philip grew up in the citrus industry, working the groves and getting hands-on education. Austin recalls,
well, to begin with, he had a small canning plant, sectionizing plant in Winter Garden, and he could see that he needed to expand eventually, and he didn't have the room out there and couldn't purchase any of the land next to him, so he just figured he had to come into Orlando. So he bought the property down South Orange Avenue and right off of Michigan.
In 1920s, the Florida citrus canning and processing industry was in its infancy. And Caruso, like Dr. Phillips, recognized the potential large profits that could be made by canning the fruit.
Our family in particular, we have always been predominantly fresh fruit packers, but the fresh fruit is always, as Dad calls it, the kid glove fruit, has always been our mainstay. But it was very interesting because you, particularly when you look back at the pictures today, you see the predominantly women, I think exclusively women, that were packing the fruit, and the men that were hauling the fruit around and loading them onto the trucks and to the rail cars, and just watching the beehive of activity.
Until then, citrus was a coveted luxury for Northerners.
Your early oranges that would come in early in the season would be Parson Browns and Hamlin oranges, and they were prized as a citrus commodity for the Christmas trade. And sometimes people would get one in a sock for Christmas, and the sock on Christmas, and that was a prized possession to have a fresh orange.
Austin Caruso remembers.
Well, in the beginning of the canning of citrus, sectionizing was pretty important. It was a good product, but it was hand-intensive.
While the canning of fruits began to take hold, the citrus industry continued to evolve. In 1935, the legislature created the Florida Citrus Commission to oversee the rapidly developing industry. By 1936, Orange County's citrus acreage was estimated at 35,000 acres. Most of the industry revolved around fresh whole fruit and the canning of citrus juice and fruit sections. But a technological breakthrough in the 1940s would be the catalyst to a whole new citrus product. During World War II, the U.S. government wanted a citrus product developed that would be stored and transported to troops overseas. Well, many citrus growers were exempt from the armed services so they could continue their citrus production. Under federal funding, scientists were gathered in Florida to find a solution. The team initially focused on powdered citrus juices, but the problem of lackluster flavor continued.
I can remember in Sunday school having the canned orange juice that was like Dad, I think, called it rot gut. It would probably take the chrome off of your bumpers on your car.
During 1943 and 1944, the Florida Citrus Commission scientists' attention turned to developing a full-flavored concentrate. The team consisted of Dr. Lewis McDowell, Dr. Edwin Moore, and Donald Atkins. In April of 1944, Dr. Lewis G. McDowell, the 39-year-old director of research for the Florida Citrus Commission, had a brainstorm. Concentrate the juice to a greater thickness than desired, then cut it back with fresh juice and freeze the works into a can. He reached for a piece of yellow scratch paper and in heavy black pencil outlined the process. The process called cutting back opened the door for a citrus marketing revolution. After sampling the new product, the Tampa Tribune wrote,
"Between the fresh juice and the concentrate we drank at the Winter Haven Citrus Laboratory, there is no difference. Here is one of the most remarkable achievements that is bound to put millions of dollars into the pockets of citrus growers."
And a man named John Fox helped make the prediction come true.
He had heard down in the Lakeland area, some citrus researchers had developed a frozen product called frozen orange juice. But they had done research, basic research, but had not moved out in the commercial field. So John Fox put two and two together, and he said, maybe my plant can be converted from making powdered orange juice to making this concentrate.
It was in April of 1946 that Florida Foods Incorporated, which later became the Minute Maid Corporation, processed the first commercial pack of frozen concentrated orange juice, reinventing the citrus industry. With the new product being so easy and economical to transport, new and worldwide markets opened up and prices of groves soared. It was the beginning of what many citrus growers referred to as the good old days. The citrus industry was growing faster than ever. New companies were formed, canning plants built, and marketing methods developed. They were the boom years. America was returning to a peacetime economy, and the research and technology associated with the war effort now focused on commercial business. For the citrus industry, frozen concentrate had become the star, requiring 80% of the orange crop to meet consumer demand. And citrus had expanded from the short window to market fresh fruit to the year-round marketing of concentrate. Florida citrus was quickly becoming a billion-dollar industry. Dr. Phillips' son Howard returned from the war and joined his father's citrus empire. Dr. and Della Phillips were supporters of improving Orlando's cultural atmosphere. Della Phillips was an accomplished pianist, while Dr. Phillips played violin. So on Sunday, they would conduct musical socials in their living room. Local musicians would serenade onlookers well into the afternoon. The Phillips were active members of the Mendelssohn Club, a forerunner of the Florida Symphony, which performed local concerts. In 1953, Dr. and Della Phillips, along with Howard, set up the Dr. Phillips Foundation as a way for them to continually give back to the community that they love so dearly. But for Orange County citrus growers, the next decade would also be filled with hardships and trouble.
Dad formed Roper Growers Co-op in 1947, and it was really a child of necessity because after the war years, the citrus business pretty well collapsed. They had been so accustomed to the government orders and things running during the war that prices had been good. And in late 46, people were buying fruit based on the 45 prices and the 46 prices, and the market collapsed.
New citrus diseases coupled with hard freezes, extremely wet weather, and the beginning of urbanization would dethrone Orange County from its position as the state's leading producing county. Dr. Phillips, possibly seeing the writing on the wall, leased some of his groves to the Minute Maid Corporation, which later purchased the groves. Minute Maid knew if the company was to succeed, they would have to market the product themselves. John Fox, Minute Maid's president, took decisive action. With no funds in the budget for advertising, he loaded his car with frozen concentrate and drove door to door offering free samples of the new concentrate. With demand for the product soared, cleaning out grocery shelves and establishing Minute Maid as a leader in the frozen concentrate market. During the 1950s, a major concern of the citrus industry was advertising. Until then, packing labels distinguished individual brands, but the concentrate revolution made the wooden crates all but obsolete and challenged the industry to target brand identification at the consumer. Public awareness has always been a major goal in marketing citrus. As early as 1924, Dr. Phillips' son Howard embarked on an ambitious marketing program. He traveled north by train until 1928, promoting Phillips citrus at each stop. 30 years later, television took center stage and revolutionized marketing to the masses.
I think this is the perfect setting for delicious Minute Maid orange juice. Minute Maid belongs here because it's good and natural like the great outdoors.
Companies like Minute Maid embraced the advent of television and were the first to realize the advantage of celebrity sponsorship.
You know it's delicious. It's Minute Maid.
As the demand for frozen concentrate grew, so did Orange County's population. Exposure to Orlando by thousands of servicemen stationed at the Orlando Army Airfield during the war resulted in a love-at-first-sight affection for the area. After the war, they descended on Orlando in droves and were a major factor in the chain reaction of urbanization. During 1950s and 60s, thousands of acres of groves were turned into suburbs. On September 14th, 1956, the announcement that the Martin Company bought a 7,300-acre site in Orange County for a defense plant created a frenzy of land speculation. Many citrus growers discovered they were first and foremost in the land business. Well, thus seeking a quick way out of the grove business, sold their land for what seemed like an exorbitant amount. However, they watched as land prices continued to climb, and the agricultural countdown began. Urbanization would continue to turn groves into housing developments, shopping centers, and later, theme parks. Playing a key role in the local development were the devastating freezes of the 1957 and 58 season.
Well, the first one that I remember actively is 57, because I was in the business then, had built a concentrate plant here in Winter Garden, and that was the first freeze we had after the advent of frozen citrus concentrate, and nobody knew what to do. And about the first 24 hours, we spent scratching our head.
Actually, the first freeze I remember, it was 1957 and 58. We had freezes in December, January, and February. Every one of them on the full moon, and every one of them was a bad freeze. So that was the first real serious freeze, particularly after concentrate got started. And a lot of people didn't know what to do with frozen fruit.
Preparing a defense against freeze damages was like preparing to go to war. Strategies were designed, equipment stationed, workers put on alert, and the cost of battle calculated. Growers tried a variety of methods to save their harvest.
I used Dad's methodology. He told me that he would get a nice comfort, pull it up around, and sleep through the night, and then the next morning he'd find out what happened.
When freezes were predicted, everybody put their work clothes on and went out in the groves, and in the early years they were able to fire groves. They burned tires and oil and stuff like that, but after a while they disallowed the burning of tires, and in the later years they used irrigation.
These freezes alone destroyed over 75% of the total citrus crop, bankrupting many growers. And to add to the destruction, the freezes were followed by 2 years of record rainfall, flooding groves and ruining crops. And just when the growers thought it couldn't get any worse, Hurricane Donna passed through Orange County. All were factors that influenced growers to consider abandoning the citrus industry and enter into the real estate trade. Then on December 12, 1962, a large air mass moved into Florida, causing what was to become known as the freeze of the century. Temperatures plummeted into the teens, and high winds blasted the groves, nullifying any natural protection. Orange County days as one of the big three citrus producers were coming to an end. The big freeze helped set the stage for rampant urbanization as growers started selling their land to speculators or becoming developers themselves. However, it was the announcement made on November 15, 1965, that ushered in the grove-eating era.
On November 15, 1965, is when Disney formally announced that they had acquired some 27,000 acres of property and was going to build the largest entertainment complex in the world. And that's when it really started going off.
This triggered the largest land speculation frenzy in Florida history. To accommodate the developments, new highways were needed, resulting in the construction of Interstate 4, the Florida Turnpike, and the Beeline Expressway, all plowing over groves and paving the way for progress. Even the famous Orange Avenue began to lose its former prestige to new shopping centers and business parks. Orange was no longer king, and the citrus industry, as well as the streets and businesses associated with it, lost its glamour. And the times were changing. Florida's population boom demanded more roads, more houses, and a variety of new businesses, all needing land covered with citrus groves. As of 1970 approached, the Orange County citrus industry was about to celebrate its 100th birthday. Trends showed citrus acreage dropping by 5,000 acres a year, indicating that the citrus industry was on its way out. By 1975, there was only one citrus grove left on Orange Avenue. The Compton family grove was started in 1925. 50 years later, it stood as the sole reminder of years gone by. It was the beginning of the end for many citrus growers. Turbulent times had arrived. The 1980s became the most damaging decade in the history of the citrus industry. New challenges from foreign markets, quality issues, hurricanes, and severe freezes finally broke the back of the Orange County's golden dream. The period between 1981 and 89 brought the most severe freezes ever clustered in such a short time frame. The first trouble came on Sunday, January 12, 1981, when the temperatures dropped into the teens, recording a loss of over 30 million boxes of oranges. Then, almost a year to the day, a second freeze gripped Florida in 1982. This destroyed over 46 million boxes of oranges. But the freeze was only the first problem faced by the growers. Despite the shortage of Florida oranges, growers were shocked to find orange juice prices falling. For the first time, Florida growers were feeling the impact of Brazil's massive import of citrus, signaling an overall change in the economics of the citrus industry forever. The winter of 1983 brought an even worse freeze than the previous 2 years.
Walking out of the house the morning after the 1983 freeze and knowing and seeing that the trees have turned brown and the leaves are coming off and the fruit will come off, and knowing that that is a major a major life-changing event.
Crop losses were heavy. Over 52 million boxes of oranges lost. In Lake County, the freezes killed 90% of the citrus trees, destroying any hopes for a comeback.
The temperature dropped about 50 degrees or so the night Christmas Eve, and I don't think anyone really knew that it was coming. And as freeze comes through, and the sap was up in the trees, and it just split the trees. It froze and just split the trees wide open, and you could hear them cracking as you went through the orange grove, and it was just devastating to Dad.
After a year and a half without a severe freeze, groves were starting to produce again, giving some growers a false sense of hope that the worst was behind them. Then in January 1985, a cold front swept through Florida, dropping temperatures again into the teens.
It's sort of like when the plague comes in on people. Some people drop dead, some people get sick, and some people survive without ever getting sick. And orange trees are sort of like that, and we've had a couple of freezes that on one side of the road the trees would be dying, the other side they'd be pretty good shape, lose their leaves and come right back.
And it was the end for many growers. The declining yield, coupled with Brazil's continued citrus imports, it drove prices down. For many growers, it was the final straw. The decade left the same way it arrived. During Christmas of 1989, a prolonged freeze devastated Central Florida's citrus crop to the point that not even the importing of Brazilian citrus could hold down juice prices. Central Florida could not squeeze out another drop of juice. But in the 1990s, citrus production rebounded, decreasing the demand for foreign imports, and Florida again took control of the U.S. market, setting off a trend of foreign investment in Florida's citrus industry. Brazilian-owned companies began purchasing Florida's processing plant and becoming partners with their American counterparts. And by 1997, over 20% of the processing industry was owned by companies with links in Florida and Brazil. And with the profitability of exporting and importing based on the logistics of transporting and handling the product, and the demand for U.S. citrus continued to grow. Many companies look forward to e-commerce to open up worldwide markets. They know that integrating the supply chain from the grower to the retailer is the great promise of internet commerce. In the years ahead, technology will play an increasing role in the citrus industry. Electronic databases will help growers cut production costs. Advances in new tolerant rootstock varieties and mechanical harvesting equipment will change the way growers do business. The citrus of tomorrow will be more wholesome, requiring less expendable resources and chemicals. Orange County conjures up a legacy blinded by the bright lights of theme parks and space-age technology. A citrus legacy that pioneered the growth and prosperity of Central Florida. Just look around and you'll recognize timeless tributes to those families who shaped Central Florida into a community rich in heritage. A heritage slowly fading into history. Yet, as growers today work the land like their fathers and mothers before them, they are the links to that legacy and future generations.
So when you think about those ancestors who have gone before you and their commitment to the land and their commitment to growing a tree and sacrificing after freezes to put in new resets and to grow another tree and to keep the trees growing, it becomes more than an economic decision.
If you would like to learn more about the world of citrus, log on to the WMFE website at www.wmfe.org.
A Citrus Legacy was made possible by a grant from the Dr. P. Phillips Foundation.